Welcome to another episode of Worlds Within. Who wants to expose some communists? Let's get straight into it. So far, we've seen that the ideological roots of modern education essentially stem from psycho-spiritual warfare. The psychological aspects of the student are pressured into obedience and compliance, while the spiritual nature of the student is outright denied through the suppression of free thought and free will. So, if we are dealing with an education system that is designed for controllers to simply implement the limits of thinking their particular agendas require, where is this being applied today? Let's step outside of the American state of affairs to study the influence of China on the Canadian education system. Given what we've uncovered so far, and the fact that the Prussian schooling system was implemented around the same time in both Canada and the US, let's see how this warfare is being adapted to suit Canadian corruption in particular, to get a sense of the scope of communist infiltration across North America. Firstly, on a public policy level and from the stance of foreign affairs, Canada firmly downplays the horrific human rights abuses that are ongoing in China. It's important that we set this stage initially to understand the grander context in which the current educational infrastructure is being accessed directly by the CCP. With this in mind, it's no mystery that the Canadian government doesn't see any national security or human rights problems with some of the CCP schemes being run here. Much of this is outlined in an Epoch Times article entitled "Calls Abound for Scrutiny of Chinese Money and Influence in Canadian Universities and Think Tanks." In the realm of post-secondary education, they outline that, quote, several Canadian universities have partnerships with Chinese telecom giant Huawei, worth millions of dollars. Many host Beijing-funded Confucius Institutes, and many are reliant on tuition fees. Charles Burton, former Canadian diplomat to China and senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, found that the reason for no significant discourse in Canada on issues related to China was due to the domination of Chinese money, and that this resulted from the historic admiration by the Liberals under Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau of Cuba's Fidel Castro and China's Mao Zedong. Thus, the interests of ideology and major businesses took precedent over the interests of national security in Canada's China policy. Additionally, they explain that the Education Minister of New Brunswick, Dominic Carty, put a halt to the presence of Beijing's Confucius Institute's program for being full-blown communist propaganda. Carty is quoted as saying, "Their job is to create a friendly, cheerful face for a government that is responsible for more deaths than nearly any other in the history of our species." If that's not overt enough, the article also outlines that individuals such as Paul Lin have been identified by Canadian intelligence as communist operatives. Quote, Paul Lin, a leftist Canadian academic who lived in communist China and was close to high-ranking regime leaders, was in regular contact with Pierre Trudeau's foreign policy advisor. Lin, who was the head of the Centre for East Asian Studies at McGill University, used his position to mount a drive for a new political, diplomatic, economic, and academic relationship between China and Canada. With their foothold firmly in major Canadian think tanks and universities, the CCP is actively engaged in a war for Canadian minds. Unsurprising given the roots of the education system itself. It's basically a matter of plug and play into this corrupt system. And once they are plugged into the system, it's a matter of implementing the techniques they have long relied upon. In the same article, it states that, quote, Stephen Mosher, a social scientist and author who has conducted research in China, told the Epoch Times that the Chinese regime has always paid a lot of attention to academia, as it sees academic discourse as favorable to its position as an opportunity to strengthen its power. In their book, How the Spectre of Communism is Ruling Our World, the Epoch Times unpacks the psychological warfare strategy that communism has utilized within Western education systems. Number one, communist elements in primary and secondary education. They use the dumbing down of students, the destructive nature of progressive education. They work on ruining students' moral character. They attack with psychological manipulations, and they utilize the infiltration of education itself. Now, we'll get into some specific examples of particular communist operations in younger students in a little bit, but it's important to note here that if students can be groomed in primary schooling, their availability to manipulation within post-secondary institutions is far more effective. More relevant to what we found today, they also list the specific tactics being applied within post-secondary institutions. Number 2, communism in Western universities. They utilize the leftist slant of university faculties to begin their infiltration. Then there's the reshaping of traditional academics with communist ideologies, and then using these new academic fields for ideological infiltration, such as political correctness. Promoting leftist radicalism becomes a major part of the universities, of course, and denying America's great traditions. Opposing the classics of Western civilization. And of course, there's the monopolizing of textbooks and liberal arts. And finally, within the universities, there is this re-education, this brainwashing and moral corruption that all of this culminates into. So if we look back on how education in North America has always been authoritarian in nature, it's no surprise that this level of infiltration into our education system has been relatively easy for Communist China. Coming back to the article outlining the CCP influence on Canadian universities and think tanks, we're given a little more insight into how Canadian intelligence is openly explaining the effectiveness of these infiltration operations. Quote, in addition to warning that Chinese authorities covertly influenced at least some of the tens of thousands of Chinese students studying in Canada in order to monitor the 5 poisons, such as pro-democracy, dissidents, or supporters of Taiwan, the CSIS warned that non-traditional collectors of information were interested in acquiring sensitive technology and information. Of note here is their particular influence on Chinese students who have left to study abroad, but this goes the other way as well. Even teachers working abroad in China on behalf of Canadian educational institutions are overtly censored and controlled. According to a Globe and Mail article entitled "China Censors Canadian Curriculums at International Schools," quote, they have torn pages out of textbooks and placed stickers over content that might offend Chinese officials. They have purged maps that did not show Taiwan as a province of China and urged their staff to show deference to the Communist Party. They have refused to hire teachers who wear hijabs or have links to Tibetan groups. More than 80 international schools in China teach curricula developed by Canadian provinces and issue provincial diplomas, part of an education business that has become an important pillar of commerce between the two countries. But people who have worked at these schools say they have made compromises to please Chinese authorities. That includes editing their own lesson plans, especially in senior high school social studies classes, to fit the dictates of Beijing rather than the provincial education ministries that approve their textbooks. Meanwhile, teachers are seeking to defend this censorship. Quote, our job and the reason that we were in China was to provide a pathway to graduation so that the Chinese kids could get into Western universities. Consider how absurd this is, given the fact that the Western universities are already known to be replete with communist propaganda, spies, and think tanks themselves. The article goes on to say that, quote, one former principal in China described removing pages from a brand new Alberta social studies textbook. Among the deleted pages was a section on Tibet and the pursuit of national self-determination, which describes the Tibet Autonomous Region as a province of China that was once part of a separate nation. The textbook includes a photo of the Dalai Lama and appends a 1950 quote in which he says, the armed invasion of Tibet for the incorporation of Tibet in communist China through sheer physical force is a clear case of aggression. These are all examples of a massive systemic war on developing minds. Our education systems are a battlefield for complex psychological warfare, and the CCP has gained major inroads into how we think, what we think about, and what Canadian authorities are willing to censor for money and power. Consider how saturated countries like Canada and America have to be with communist influence, that students studying at North American designed and approved schools in China are subjected to communist propaganda, only to then graduate and come to North American universities full of think tanks and associations pushing propaganda that covers up the CCP's atrocities. And what's more, these universities are also harboring spying and intelligence gathering programs for the CCP. Quote, another initiative of the CCP to exert influence in academia, he says, is the 1,000 Talents program, declared by Beijing as being intended to attract foreign experts to China. The U.S. National Intelligence Council says the program is a means to enable technology transfer to China. The FBI recently arrested the chair of Harvard's University Chemistry Department, Charles Lieber, for allegedly lying about his financial involvement in the Chinese regime. Authorities allege that he was under contract as part of the 1,000 Talents program while working on sensitive U.S. research. This is just a glimpse into how entangled North American education is with covert and highly sophisticated foreign infiltration. Once again, we have to remember that an education system built upon dogma and subservience to authority is meant to produce servile, unthinking citizens. Recipients of these dark influences have already been through a gauntlet of misinformation and social engineering by the time they get to university. So how do we move forward? And how can we find compassion for students under the influence of forces beyond their comprehension?